In a bleak day for Australian media, News Corp has announced it will stop the presses on more than 100 of its titles. Suburban and regional papers will go online only or be axed altogether, a move that'll trigger massive job losses and see community voices spanning generations silenced.
Hello, I'm Paul Barry. Welcome to Media Watch. And the damage from COVID-19 continues with yet more casualties in the media. The latest cuts will put hundreds of journalists out of work and be a devastating blow for communities around Australia, who will lose their local newspapers and many of the reporters who bring them their news. As one retrenched journalist tweeted,
"Today, I was one of many News Corp journos made redundant. For 8 months, Warwick has been my home and I've loved every bloody minute of it. Regional news is important and remains a vital part of small communities."
Media businesses around the world have been struggling for years as tech giants like Google and Facebook have hoovered up their advertising. But the economic downturn brought on by a global pandemic has accelerated the decline. As we've reported, online newcomers like BuzzFeed News and 10 Daily have shut up shop. Dozens of regional newspapers have suspended printing or closed altogether. And Newswire AAP is likely to shed jobs even if a new owner steps in to save it. And now News Corp, one of the country's biggest employers of journalists, is cutting hard too. In May, the company said while digital subscribers are growing, advertising revenue is down more than 45%. And so the knife is falling.
From the suburbs of our major cities to nearly 100 newspaper titles stretching across Queensland, New South Wales, the ACT and Victoria, to Tasmania, South Australia and the Northern Territory, printing presses that in some cases have rumbled for more than a century are set to fall silent.
That includes suburban titles from Brisbane's Quest newspapers, Melbourne's Leader Group, Adelaide's Messenger and Sydney's News Local.
The Parramatta Advertiser, founded 1933. The offices today deserted, vacant, with confirmation they won't be printing again.
Regional, weekly and bi-weekly papers in Queensland, New South Wales and the Northern Territory will also no longer be printed. And almost a dozen daily newspapers up and down the Queensland and New South Wales coast in major centres like Mackay, Rockhampton, Bundaberg and Ipswich will also disappear.
The Queensland Times, formerly the Ipswich Herald, has circulated since the 1860s. It's one of more than 30 titles across Queensland that'll no longer be printed. There'll be no daily papers between Townsville and Brisbane.
Losing the papers does not mean these communities will all lose their news. For most, there will be a future in digital. And News Corp boss Michael Miller was keen to assure readers news is committed to the regions.
More than 375 journalists will be specifically covering regional and community news and information. They will continue to serve and live in their local communities, with the majority in regional Queensland where we have most of our titles.
But while 375 sounds like a lot, current staffing levels are believed to be at least 1,200. So 2/3 will go. And too bad if print is your primary source of news. As ABC reporter Caitlin Gribbin noted from Warwick, which will lose its daily paper.
A big part of the readership base of a newspaper is older people. And the point's been made to me this morning that a lot of elderly people don't have internet access, especially not if you live on a farm, for example.
And some towns will really feel the pain. In Gladstone, for example, the loss of its daily paper, The Observer, comes only a month after Seven closed its TV newsroom, the last in town. And with the closest ABC radio station 100 kilometres away, the area will now be a news desert. The Sunshine Coast, population 350,000, will also lose its daily paper, at least in print, and up to 1/3 of its 25 staff. Local Mayor Mark Jamieson, who used to run APN, the company that owned the Sunshine Coast Daily, told the ABC,
I can recall in my time as the Chief Executive, we had over 2,000 employees across newspaper titles in Queensland and northern New South Wales. You know, that's probably, I don't know, down to a fifth or a fourth maybe now.
When News Corp purchased APN 3.5 years ago to secure a virtual monopoly of print and online news in Queensland, News claimed it was buying, quote, strong newspaper brands with vibrant newspaper operations. So, what went wrong so quickly? News blames Google and Facebook and now coronavirus. But, in fact, much of the lucrative property advertising that helped sustain those papers has gone to realestate.com.au. in which News Corp has a 2/3 stake worth around $8 billion. So, not all bad news for news, which will continue to get the ad revenue but not have to spend so much on journalism. No doubt that's one reason why long-time Murdoch critic, former PM Kevin Rudd, had this to say.
Laid dead on the carpet because Murdoch, comfortably sitting over there in New York on his 17.6 bill, says, I couldn't give a rat's.
So, what does the future hold for these communities now that all their local news, if they're getting it at all, will be online? News Corp's regional media boss Bryce Johns is upbeat.
The numbers in the region are that good that we have a very high level of faith that this is a model that's going to work for a lot of years. It's very, very clear that if you write the right stuff, people are prepared to support the journalism by paying for it.
But what is the right stuff? As former News Corp editor Michael Crutcher told the ABC, the desire to maximise clicks can drive reporters in directions that don't serve the community.
Sometimes the most popular stories online aren't the sort of things that we talk about holding governments to account, if you like.
So, with fewer reporters publishing online only, expect to see less scrutiny of local government spending and the courts. As journalist and academic Margaret Simons told the ABC,
you know that pre-COVID, about a third of local governments in Australia were not reported, that no journalists sitting in council meetings, no journalists ringing up after the meetings, querying decisions and so on. We're seeing police forces who are concerned that the deterrent effect of them charging people is reduced because magistrates' courts aren't reported, and real reductions in accountability and in social cohesion.
Simon says we need the government to treat journalism like a public service, think libraries, schools or roads, and help fund news where communities need it most. The Commonwealth has already put up $50 million in grants for regional media operators, but Labor and the Journalists Union say it's not nearly enough. And as the cuts continue, it is hard to disagree. It's also hard to see much hope. But in the town of Narra Court, southeast of Adelaide, one entrepreneur launched his own newspaper when the local paper, owned by Australian Community Media, suspended operations due to the pandemic. His 1,700 copies sold out in 2 days, so he printed 400 more.
I really can't think of many worse business models to try to underwrite. But it actually, the fact that the incumbent was stepping off the field and yet the life was still going. I mean, in some ways barely in some of these towns, but Narra Court was still hanging on. That actually created the environment that you could do this.
Clearly, Australians still want local news. Let's hope the community and government funding can bring some of it back. And while we're looking at the carnage wrought by COVID-19 and the lockdown, let's take a look at the latest alarming warning on what will happen to the Australian economy.
We are in the early stages of an economic collapse similar to the Great Depression. That's according to a leading US financial commentator, Harry Dent, who then goes on to say this is a 2-year meltdown between late 2020 and late 2022, and nothing can stop it. It will be the biggest crash of our lives.
That prediction from the US commentator sent the Australian media into a frenzy, generating doom and gloom headlines like this.
Nothing can stop it.
Sydney and Melbourne property prices could fall by 50% as debt bubble set to burst, Economist warns.
And appearing on a YouTube channel hosted by Australian property analyst Martin North, Harry Dent's advice was to get out of the market ASAP.
Sell it and rebuy later. If you got a vacation home, sell it. You can always rebuy a better one, probably at half the price or less, later.
Now, this is not the first time the celebrity doomsayer, who has books and seminars to sell, has made predictions about Australia's housing market. Back in 2011, Dent went on Sunrise to predict a 50% fall in prices and advised Australians to take cover.
This is something you have to get out of the way of. If you're a young couple, do not buy a house if you're getting married for another 3 years and let the crash happen and then this greatest sale in history. I mean, who doesn't like a sale? Imagine buying stocks and real estate 50, 60, 70% lower.
Let's hope we didn't act on that advice, because after a dip of less than 5%, Australian home prices took off. But that didn't stop Harry Dent making another gloomy prediction 3 years later.
A US forecaster has painted a picture of real estate Armageddon, predicting Australia's property prices could plummet by as much as 50% in coming years.
And as you can see from the graph, he was wrong again as house prices continued to climb. So, was this enough to stop the Australian media paying attention? Not at all. In 2018, Nine's Today Show welcomed him back for yet another doomsday forecast.
Australian property prices crashing by 50% in the next few weeks, a new global financial crisis and another Great Depression.
Dent was back again in 2019 and yet again last month, as we saw, singing the same tune. But we're glad to say not everyone is joining the chorus, with 3AW's Ross Stevenson delivering this scathing verdict.
There's a bloke called Dent, who they usually wheel out on these occasions, who predicts savage declines in property prices that never ever happen. Blow me down. US author and financial commentator Harry Dent has warned Australia of a looming financial crash of a lifetime which would bring mass unemployment and widespread bankruptcies. That is the greatest sign of all time that it will never happen, because this bloke is never right. Yet.
So, fourth or is it fifth time lucky? Why should we believe Harry Dent this time? We asked Dent and he told us a long and detailed reply.
My mistakes in the past several years have been anticipating this unprecedented bubble bursting sooner. The current pandemic has triggered a recession that is bigger than the Great Depression.
You can read his full response on our website. And maybe this time it is different. Who knows? But finally, something which is very much the same. The Bushfire Royal Commission kicked off last week with a dire warning that the Herald Sun reported like this.
Horror, not a one-off.
Scientists have warned that greenhouse gas-driven climate change will bring more horrific fire seasons, floods and deadly weather events over the next century.
One of the experts making that grim prediction was the Weather Bureau's head of climate monitoring, Dr. Carl Braganza, who told us to prepare for longer and more extreme fire seasons ahead.
The trends probably load the dice towards worse fire seasons in general.
Now, none of this was new. We heard the same expert warnings during the summer bushfire crisis. And sad to say, over on Sky News, the response to the Bushfire Commission was not new either.
What is depressingly predictable and worrying, they started with climate change.
Chris Kenny is now prepared to accept that climate change may be making bushfires worse, but he still thinks there's no point in talking about it.
So the Royal Commission's climate focus is a waste of time, a waste of energy and a needless sop to the political agitators. If you think a carbon price in Canberra or a renewable energy project in Queensland can reduce our bushfire threat, then I'm sorry, you're not worth listening to.
And sure enough, Kenny's fellow sceptics on Sky agreed, with Andrew Bolt lamenting.
But here we go again with the bushfires inquiry which opened today. Blaming global warming, you see, is easy, but it's dangerous because it can blind us to truths that might save us next time. Or they could panic us if you blame the wrong thing.
And there was a similar reaction to the Commission's experts from Sky's Rowan Dean, who essentially warned viewers the Bureau of Meteorology is not to be trusted, and beware of anyone linking bushfires to climate change because they have an agenda. As Chris Kenny would say, depressingly predictable and worrying. No amount of expert evidence, it seems, is prepared to make them change their minds. Meanwhile, on the ABC's science show, climate change was also the hot topic.
Climate's back. Never went away. Does it make you grieve?
Climate Grief is a new series from the ABC's veteran science broadcaster Robin Williams, which explores the emotional side of the issue and, quote, the turmoil that comes with severe climate change. And in the first episode, the guest was a well-known scientist.
Ove Hugelberg is a marine scientist at the University of Queensland. He's with Dr. Jonica Newby, formerly of Catalyst.
So, Ove, if we look at the 5 stages of climate grief, what stage do you think you're at the moment?
Well, I guess I'm not at the top, which is total despair, but I'm more than just being worried now.
An excellent communicator, Professor Hugh Goldberg shared lots of science and personal stories in his 40-minute chat. But at the end of the interview, the plug was not for the professor's book about the Great Barrier Reef, it was for his interviewers.
Professor of Marine Science Ove Hugelberg was with Dr. Jonica Newby, formerly of Catalyst. She's writing a book about climate grief, which will be published in 2021 by New South Press.
Now, it's at this point we'll tell you something Robin Williams did not. Dr. Jonica Newby is his partner. And the duo are back the following week for more climate grief, but this time with a singer.
This is Missy Higgins. But what's she doing in a science show?
Good question. It was not to talk about science. Missy's 50-minute chat with Jonica Newby focused on her concern about climate change and how that feeds into her music. And once again, Williams popped in a plug for his partner.
Dr. Jonica Newby, whose book on climate grief is published next year.
And in the middle of the chat, Dr. Newby even did some of her own self-promotion.
I'm writing a book about emotions, and the first one is called Grief.
Listeners desperate for some science must have been wondering if they had the right frequency. And again at the end, Robin came back for yet another plug.
Dr. Jonica Newby, formerly of Catalyst, whose book on climate grief comes out in 2021.
Again, no disclosure about their relationship. Now, surely the ABC could do better than this. A host plugging his partner's upcoming book on his own show without being upfront with his listeners. But the ABC clearly sees nothing wrong with the plugs or the lack of disclosure, telling Media Watch,
Dr. Jonica Newby is an award-winning television producer. Her personal relationship with Mr. Williams had no bearing on the decision to commission her as a freelance contributor to the Climate Grief series, which was approved by ABC editors.
We're not suggesting it did. It's the book plugs we're concerned about and the lack of disclosure. The ABC told us the book is relevant information for the audience, but 48 hours later it did concede lack of disclosure might be a problem, adding,
We acknowledge the potential perception of a conflict of interest and will disclose that relationship where appropriate in the future.
The ABC has now added a disclosure on the programme's website. Problem solved. What a shame they didn't do it earlier. That's all from us tonight. There's more on our website, including statements from the ABC and Harry Dent. And don't forget, Media Bites, every Thursday on your favourite social media platform. But for now, until next week, goodbye.